He does this every 4 to 5 years and did it with Hugh Sampson this year. So a lot of this, maybe 80% of it is from that. And it is a little daunting. We could easily spend 2.5 or 3 hours, which we don't have. So bear with me. There will be a few slides. They're actually snippets that I took from this article, and I'll point out a few things, but time doesn't permit to go into all of those. This is my disclosure slide. It's rapidly expanding. We're doing more and more food allergy desensitization. You can see right now the DBV and immune studies are really at the safety level and probably will be approved pending craziness at the FDA, which is, of course, predictable, in the next year or year and a half. And then we completed a study working with Carrie Nadeau at Stanford using omalizumab, basically 3 doses before OIT, and that has proven to be quite useful from a safety standpoint. Similar preliminary data, interestingly enough, using anti-IL-33 prior to OIT. And you'll see that this will be an increasing theme with other biologics like dupilumab and so forth. So these are the learning objectives, just to kind of review the current understanding of pathophysiology. I will spend a little bit of time and actually show you an illustrative case, a patient of mine, regarding the use of food component testing, and then very briefly touch on prevention and treatment. As Lynn said, in a couple months, here actually more like 6 or 7 weeks, Dan will actually go into detail about some of the studies that I just alluded to. And to get there, these are kind of the major topics I'll be going through. So in terms of food allergy, and I think we all get the feel of that from our clinical practices, it's pretty clear that food allergy is increasing, not just sensitization, but actual responsiveness to foods pretty dramatically. In fact, I was talking to Dan. He's doing some review of, within our practice of looking at visits. If you just pick out food allergy, either a specific food or sensitization, going back 10 years ago, we had somewhere about 500 visits. Last year we had 1,700 visits. So clearly, and some of this, of course, is interventional, where we're challenging patients more, but pretty dramatic increase. Increased more in westernized or industrial regions, if you will, kind of paralleling the increase in airborne allergy in those areas. Obviously more common in children than adults. Still the same list tops the common allergens. Looking at prevalence, as you'll see in the next few slides, can be challenging. Number one, it's sort of like looking at chronic sinus disease. It depends here how you define food allergy. Well, does that mean you had a test that was positive, which of course will increase that number, or is this somebody who clinically is reactive to a food and has demonstrable IgE in one form or another? And it can vary greatly depending on, again, the group that you study, including the age of patients and so forth. So I'll just briefly show you a couple of studies. This was published about 7 years ago in Pediatrics in the U.S., and literally asking, has your child had a physician diagnosis of food allergy? And that was at 8%. Pretty dramatic increase, and we'll talk about that in a minute. It's estimated that roughly about a third of those patients have multiple food allergies, and this specifically doesn't mean somebody with 7 tree nut allergies, but literally different allergenic groups. And about 40% of these patients experience severe reactions. In fact, that's often how they present. Europe, looking at a somewhat similar questionnaire, quite similar, about a 6% mean prevalence. I apologize, some of these have a lot of verbiage on them. But just show you a few things here, looking at some specific foods with tree nuts. This is, U.S. About 2% of TreeNut sensitized patients have demonstrable positive oral food challenge. And this is looking at a situation where there's clinical research where they literally challenged all the patients up to certain limits. Obviously, it's not ethical if you have a strong history of anaphylaxis and immunocaps over 100 and so forth. So again, a little biased with reporting. In the U.S., walnut pecan or cashew pistachios by far most common. In Europe, it's hazelnut. As far as finfish and shellfish, and this is kind of the poster child for it, depends who you study, you can see this wide range of prevalence depending on what group you look at. Looking at some specific foods, in Europe, again, 12,000 infants. The prevalence of egg allergy was a little over 1%, and you can see that is weighted in favor of the UK, which had the highest prevalence, in Greece, which had the lowest prevalence. Again, depending on what patient group you look at. Milk was 0.54, again, most common in the UK and Netherlands, and quite a bit less so in various other countries. In Australia, and you'll see this Health Nuts study, it was a kind of a prospective group cohort that was looked at over many years. Estimate 11% positive oral food challenges, but this was considering only 3 foods, and at least the group studied here was much more aggressively challenged. So to be fair, that number could be higher in other studies. And this shows you, and I think this is not unusual, that early on egg allergy was more prominent, but if you follow this over 4 years, which is what they did in this study, you can see a very high percentage of kids outgrow their egg allergy. The peanut numbers were a little surprising to me. Most studies suggest that it only goes away 20% of the time. Here, this was more like 33% of the time, even by age 4. And then sesame, a lower prevalence, but almost half of those patients were not an issue by age 4. So what about the trend over the last 20 years? And I'll show you again a couple health surveys. In the late 90s, it was estimated 3.4% of children in the U.S., whereas about 12 years later, almost a 50% increase to 5.1% of children asking exactly the same questions in the same format. So there was really no bias there in terms of changing the questionnaire. Similarly, looking at specific food, peanut, you can see the increase from 0.4 to over 3.5 times higher, 1.4% with peanut allergy. As far as sensitization, in other words, a positive test but not necessarily clinical problems, kind of interesting that rate has actually decreased. And it's similar for milk, egg, and peanut, but somewhat inexplicably, and I don't know if anyone else has seen an explanation for this, it's markedly less for shellfish than it was 30 years ago.
But you can't just leave that. How can everything else be increasing? Clinical food allergy and actual sensitization by test, the more objective thing, be decreasing. Makes no sense.
I know. That's the data. The observation, this is more common, probably 60-40 boys versus girls, men versus women. The prevalence is somewhat higher in Asian and Black versus white patients. Looking at familial patterns, looking at siblings, 66% were sensitized to foods, so very common, but only food reactive in about a quarter of those patients. If you look at genetic markers, and we'll talk about that at the end briefly again, you do see, not unlike autoimmune disease, some unique HLA DR and DQ patterns, although it's nothing you can sort of hang your hat on. And then altered methylation of DNA signatures, and this is just an example in some milk allergic patients. I'm not sure quite how clinically useful that would be, because presumably the signature might be similar with other food allergies. So this I'm not going to go over in detail. You can actually read it at your leisure. But these are several postulates for environmental risk factors for food allergy. And the word that sort of predominates on the right is limited data to support various claims. And really what I've outlined is essentially the Gideon-Lack theory that a lot of this occurs with a sort of a race between sensitization through the skin versus oral exposure. And really the only time the word strong appears is right here, which essentially comes from the LEAP study. So a lot of speculation. I was a little surprised this table didn't include some speculation about the microbiome, but it is just that. That is playing a role, perhaps coupled with genetics, for why we're seeing more food allergy. What about natural history? As you know, many foods, wheat, egg, milk, and soy, typically are outgrown, but not always. And you can see the numbers here for, although it again depends what group you look at, but roughly by age 5, 6, 7, you can pretty much predict for parents that kids with these food allergies, there's at least a 50% chance it will be gone by then. As you know, peanut, tree nuts, seeds, and seafood tend to be not outgrown. Interestingly enough, with peanut, most kids that are going to outgrow peanut allergy do so by 4 years of age. And I'll show you some things you can sort of hang your hat on with initial skin test and immunocaps. If parents ask you, what are the odds of this? I'm usually a little vague with my response, like we'll follow this over time. But there are some data that are pretty predictive of that. Not a lot of studies for the shellfish, finfish, like there are for peanut and tree nuts, but that's the estimate. So a little more likely than peanut and tree nut to go away. But obviously these are the most common adult food allergies. In predicting the resolution of egg allergy, and most of this is probably common sense, but obviously the lower your baseline initial specific IgE is by immunocap or skin testing, often if the initial presentation reflects just mild facial symptoms, granted that might be biased by how much the child eats and how messy of an eater they are, because they're essentially skin testing themselves. Those that present earlier with tolerance for egg and baked goods, and of course part of that's a catch-22, because you may decide to challenge these kids based on their initial data and get them on baked goods as soon as possible. And as we all know from several studies, most of them out of Sinai, that regular ingestion of egg and baked goods actually does help induce tolerance versus continued avoidance. The persistence of peanut allergy, in other words, at the 95% level, can be gleaned by initial skin test or specific IgE. So if the data shows levels above that, you can predict with very high certainty that this is a child probably that's not going to ever outgrow peanut allergy, unless we finally have some therapies for desensitization in the next 2 years.
Frank, with the baked egg, has anybody looked at the temperature specificity of that? Do you have to bake it at 350 or 425? Or?
I don't know specifically, Mary or David.
Well, you know what? Because like for muffins and stuff, it's supposed to be like, you just want it cooked through, right? You don't want it, so it's like 350 for like 20 to 30 minutes for like a cupcake or for something that's thicker. But like pancakes, you don't have to cook them as long because they're thinner. And so just when it's cooked through is pretty much, and I always tell families that, I usually say like 1 egg per 1 cup of flour, is kind of how, so like when you make a cake, there's like 2.5 to 3 cups of flour in a cake box mix. So it always calls for about 3 eggs, which is about, 2 to 3 eggs. So that's what I,
Yeah, as opposed to flan or something.
Yeah. Great.
Something that's less well cooked. I just thought I'd throw these in. Bob Wood actually gave a couple of talks. He unfortunately had a family thing come up, so he gave them, believe it or not, online from Baltimore at the Western meeting. So he didn't actually go to Hawaii. But I thought I'd pull these up for a couple reasons. These are data from Hopkins, published about 11 years ago, and are somewhat useful if you look at initial immunocaps early on. You can see, obviously, over time, following this, and again, not surprisingly, milk is a little cleaner in that regard, but you can see for milk, really, unless it's over 20, it's very likely these patients are going to outgrow this. You follow that over time. Egg is a little more confusing because one of the higher ranges you can see actually really drops off here. One of the difficulties is some of these groups, which I'm not showing you, have only 1 or 2 patients in them in this study, so you may not really get a feel for the full volume. This group also published that about 12 to 15% of patients don't outgrow these allergies, and that certainly is not my experience. I don't know for those of you also in the community. I have 2 patients that are adults in 30 years that have milk allergy. I have none that have egg allergy. And perhaps so, this is maybe biased by the groups of patients that are getting sent to Hopkins, sort of the worst of the worst, that maybe, community people are not comfortable dealing with, or there are studies that these patients could enroll with. Again, the bottom line is we follow these patients, obviously, over time. A couple words about pathophysiology. As you know, we can get sensitized through the skin, GI tract, more so probably than the respiratory tract, but all of those are potentially target organs. Much like the current approach with allergy or autoimmunity, it's felt that this indeed is due to lack of very specific T regulatory cells. There's also more and more speculation that the microbiome may play a role in concert with genetics, where upon exposure, essentially the epithelia releases IL-33, and that, as you'll see, I think more and more is playing a very important role in expanding the allergic response through the mechanisms I mentioned. Interacting with OX40 ligand on dendritic cells to lead to a Th2 response, also interacting with type 2 innate lymphoid cells to further suppress T regulatory response and further drive IgE production, and other lymphokines such as IL-25 and TSLP certainly play a role. And I know those are being looked at also as products that could be blocked that may be useful in a preventative way or in a way when we desensitize patients. Another interesting thing, and it's hard to know what comes first, but when you study this in animal models, what's observed is that mast cells are also somewhat abnormal in the GI tract, producing increased interleukin-9, interleukin-13, tryptase, etc. The role of IL-9 leads to more mast cell activation, which also leads to further suppression of T regulatory cells. In contrast, tolerance is induced through CD8 CD103 dendritic cells in the GI tract, and the analogous cells, CD11b positive dendritic cells or Langerhans cells in the skin.
Frank, since you brought up, before you move to that, in a pragmatic sense, what do you tell patients who you know are atopic, want to have food tests? They're going to have positive food tests, but they're tolerant. They already told you they eat the food.
Right.
You tell them, well, if you ate the food, you don't need to be tested. You prove you're not allergic.
Correct.
And they have trouble understanding that difference between sensitization without clinical allergy. Right?
Yes.
I don't know. What are those of you in the room who deal with a lot of food allergy? How do you explain this to people? I don't know how to explain it to myself.
The key point is to not blindly test a bunch of food.
Right.
No,
You know what I tell them?
They often insist on it.
Well, I know, but I tell them that allergy skin testing for foods is terrible. It's 50% accurate. And I said, if you have a good history and you get a positive test, it correlates really well.
Right.
But if you tell me you eat it and I give you a positive skin test, you're still fine, so we don't need to test you. I mean, that's what we do it all day long. I just tell them it's terrible.
Yeah.
And I tell them I will.
Well, and you can also say that skin tests often lag behind clinical tolerance. I mean, not only with foods, but when you think about it, airborne allergy is a great example too. When you're creating tolerance with IT, the skin test will be positive for years, and yet here's a patient who's using 90% less. Not exactly the same thing, but the bottom line is looking at those major foods when obviously sometimes you're going to get this as a child with moderate to severe eczema, doesn't seem to be reacting, but it turns out he's not eating much of anything yet. Then it does make sense in a screening way to do that, but you have to live obviously with the possibility of a positive, which isn't, and that's where knowing projective curves of likely tolerance, let's do a food challenge. And but really the take home, which we'll go over in a minute, is if you have a great history, but sort of unexpectedly a low immunocap or skin test, that's a great patient to challenge. If you have the opposite of a horrendous history and the tests are negative, to be fair, you might hedge by doing an immunocap as well as a skin test. But that's also a good patient to test or think, well, what weird ingredient are we missing in this shrimp curry or something? It turns out it's an auto seed and it's not shrimp at all. So it's, like everything else we do every day, probably it's history, and then retrenching and say now, eating, well, I think he ate a peanut once. You get sometimes those vague things, but you're right, it's sort of a little bit of artsy.
Yeah. Well, I actually find your analogy with respiratory allergy an excellent one, because we accept readily that you put people on immunotherapy, they get clinically better, but we know their skin tests will still be positive years into that. So we're actually, early on, when you put people on immunotherapy, their IgE goes up, even though they get clinically better. Yeah. So I'm just saying to myself, although I'm perplexed by explaining it in the context of food allergy, I accept it every day with respiratory allergy, while it's not necessarily that discordant.
Right.
Well, Frank, one of the things I used to think that was probably an issue too is when you put food in your mouth, the salivary enzymes already start degrading the protein. So perhaps that's one of the reasons. And in some of the cultures where the moms mouth and chew stuff before they feed it their babies, I think that may explain some of it.
No.
Just partial digestion of the proteins.
Yeah, well, no, exactly.
And in fact, I thought there should be a saliva food test where you spit in a cup and mix the food in there, and then skin test with that. And if it's negative, you say, go ahead and eat it. Just chew it well,
Yeah. Well, or the other possibility is we like to think skin tests correlate pretty well.
Yeah.
And the answer is pretty well, not always. And so obviously sometimes, and it works the other way, there's a disconnect between what you see in the skin or blood and what's really relevant. In other words, the GI tract, right?
Yeah.
Is this child going to tolerate the food? And, you go with what is 80 or 90% likely, but sometimes you're shocked, right, at the response. Like I thought, sure, this child would have no trouble going through this food challenge. Or the opposite, as we'll see. I mean, there's, patients reported with 2 over 100 that actually tolerate peanut. Well, what's up with that? What the answer must be that what's in their GI tract is totally different than what you're detecting serologically. All right, well, as Len mentioned, some of this, I think we've had talks on EOE. David will be talking about FPIs, but just briefly, it's really not totally known, I think, what drives EOE to begin with. My personal thought is that probably acid is the primary target, and we kind of know this from 70 or 80% of patients with EOE are not allergic to anything. So there's got to be some primary hit, presumably maybe analogous to what happens in the sinuses with eosinophilic sinus disease, where there may be chronic infection products are also the primary hit. But ultimately you get this Th2-like pathway, with the exception of IL-4, except in allergic patients and except maybe in pollen-related patients with OAS, driving the disease. FPIs remains a bit of a mystery. David will talk to you more in detail, but one of the leading theories is that some sort of innate immune defect, but in animal studies demonstrating some evidence for also a Th2-like response, but again, not really IgE related.
Frank, just again ask a pragmatic question. When I see adults, I've never had an adult with EOE have a positive skin test. So I wonder why even test them. The only reason I test them is the gastroenterologist expects it, I'm going to test them.
Right.
But I usually tell people that there's no purpose in doing it. Is anybody here boldly enough that just don't test for food? You still test just because it's a community standard.
There's some data that suggests
even
that
at the U you do it.
Well, there's some data that suggests, at least for environmental allergens, that there is some correlation. So patients with EOE will more likely to be diagnosed during peak pollen season. So at least for environmental allergens, it's just good to see their level
What
of
about
HP.
food?
I might do a few just to see. To be honest, it's primarily, I think, T-cell driven. If you talk to Jonathan Spurgel at CHOP, he thinks it's a T-cell mediated process. And he doesn't really have a strong explanation for the IgE component. But I'll still test just to see, just to establish that it's negative, just for a few things, whether that's right or wrong.
No, I mean, I still do it because it's, if I don't do it, they're going to get the wrong answer from somebody else. So.
I mean, just somewhat anecdotally, I mentioned this a few years ago, but I have probably 4 or 5 adolescents that have developed EOE. And these are kids that are allergic to birch and grass with minimal OAS, and I actually retested some of them. And for example, the carrot, before they were clinically active, had a 4 millimeter skin test. When I tested them with active EOE, it was 40 millimeters, suggesting that suddenly you've got this abnormal epithelia here, and it really may enhance. And there's sort of a disconnect between how much it bothers the patient in terms of itching and so forth, but you may be actually enhancing the problem with these OAS foods, whereas once their esophagus, once their esophagus is back to normal, somebody grab me a towel over there, spilled my coffee. Once you get their esophagus back to normal, much like getting an eczema patient's skin back to normal, they actually can tolerate the food again. All right, well, I've got a fair amount to cover here in the next half hour, so I'm going to kind of gloss over a few things. But probably the most key part of this algorithm, which is from Scott Sitcher's article, is the word history in the top left. But really trying to make a determination, is this consistent with an IgE-mediated response? Sometimes you don't always know that with certain foods. And again, proceeding down the algorithm as we do on a daily basis. But this also makes the point here that I mentioned earlier, that if there's a strongly suggestive history but a not so strongly suggestive skin or blood test, those can be great patients to challenge. And the analogous patient where there's a very suggestive history, maybe on multiple occasions, but the tests aren't showing much, that can also be a useful patient to challenge. So in terms of diagnosis, we all on a daily basis know this. Really, as Mary and David were alluding to, often trying to pin down the timing, you know, ate the food, when did you have symptoms? Obviously, something 6 hours later is not consistent with an IgE-mediated response. What is the prior ingestion history? Is this an atopic patient? I'd say 80 or 90% of the time these are kids with eczema. So you know that if not today, they're ultimately going to be atopic. And then selectively looking at skin or immunocaps, and then in certain cases making decisions about oral food challenges, which can be quite revealing and possibly lead to, in the case of egg or milk for 80% of patients, therapeutic intervention. In other words, you get them on baked goods and you know that that will actually help them outgrow their allergy. Component testing, I'm going to say a few words about in a second. We all know that intradermal skin tests for foods are not good. The specificity is awful and shouldn't be done. Total IgE is rarely helpful, although I would say it can be helpful in kids with severe eczema. Often these kids, not true hyper IgE, but if they have a total IgE of 4,000 or 3,000, I would submit you interpret an IgE of 15 in a different way, because you do, despite manufacturer claims, get background noise when you do immunocaps. And ironically, those are the patients you have to do them in, because they're covered with eczema and you can't skin test them. Specific IgG4, as you know, is not terribly helpful, except maybe for milk and EOE. Just throw that in there. So I thought I'd take a second to present a patient of mine who remains kind of a fascinoma, at least to me. So I've seen him since he was four months of age, actually. Typical child presenting with eczema. In retrospect, he was a kid that we could have done the LEAP procedure on. He had a peanut of 4 millimeters in the first year of life. And as was the approach then, we were like, well, let's watch that over time. And we watched it mutate into 15 millimeters as a toddler after he anaphylaxed a peanut. At the time, he was skin test positive, and the reason we did all these other legumes is the family's vegetarian. But he clearly, perhaps the poster child for getting them in the diet early on, tolerated all these other legumes without any trouble. Over time, he, not surprisingly, developed pollen allergy, including birch and grass. And at some point I said, well, let's see where we're at. Keeping in mind from that initial peanut, we would have predicted he's probably not going to outgrow the peanut allergy. And you can see the data. Probably 90+% of this is the seed storage proteins, ARA-H1, 2, and 3. So obviously we decided not to even consider doing a challenge. Wasn't interested in going on a study. So about 4 months ago, though, he decided his mom is a great cook, and she made this new tofu dish, which he loved. And he ate 3 times the usual amount, being an adolescent. And then he promptly went out and played lacrosse, and essentially ended up in the ER with six rounds of epi. And so the question is, well, how much of this was the food? How much of it was exercise anaphylaxis? But he admitted that, as he was finishing the dish, his throat felt kind of funny, but typical kid just said, oh, well, whatever. And so I decided to actually do some soy components, and these were the results. GlyM5 and GlyM6 are analogous to ARA-H1 and 2. And you can see that GlyM4 is analogous to ARA-H8, which are the PR10 components. So even though he was extremely allergic to pollens, unfortunately, this is a patient where for peanut and soy, his responsiveness is kind of to the more serious components. Well, of course, he wouldn't leave it at that. 2 weeks later, his mom made this curry dish for the first time, with 27 ingredients.
Holy cow.
And he loved it, went crazy with it. And while he was sitting at the table, felt like his throat was swelling shut. So no exercise this time. And he ended up going to the ER, etc. Finally settled down, came in. So we methodically tested him. Make a long story short, the only thing that showed up was fenugreek. And it turns out, and very impressively so, he had indeed never really had exposure that he knew of before, but it turns out fenugreek also contains components which are seed storage proteins and very analogous to ARIH1 and 3. Interestingly enough, after all of this, just anecdotally, he gives a pretty good history of dysphagia for quite some time. So he is, I think this week, is seeing the GI person to get scoped to see if he's also one of these patients that, despite tolerance over time, allegedly has maybe been tolerating a lot of symptoms and really ramped up his sensitization. So I thought I'd throw this in. A good friend of mine, Motohiro Ebisawa, gave one of the plenaries at the recent Academy meeting, and I took the liberty of adding a few other key foods here. And this is a great, for the fellows, you may want to memorize some of these for the boards. So these essentially, except for the two ones with asterisks, are lipid transfer proteins, but they also are very heat insensitive. All of the others are analogous to seed storage proteins. So if you have a patient that sort of inexplicably doesn't seem to tolerate much of the food despite a fairly small skin or blood test, these are all components that you can actually check to try to clarify.
So these are all available now?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can get them all as panels through Thermo Fisher.
The only ones I've used much are the peanut ones.
Right.
You've used the others?
Well, I've had a few. I think Mary, and I don't know about you, David, but I think Mary does a little more with this with egg and milk. I sort of go with the party line that 80 to 85% of the time, the relevant allergen for egg and milk allergic children is not these. But a few years ago, I gave a talk about just what you asked about. Why am I positive to the food, but I can eat it, or vice versa? And ovomucoid and casein, of course, are components where. So I've had a couple of dramatically failed egg and baked good challenges with skin tests of 4 millimeters. So then I went back and actually checked, and indeed, this was a kid who was totally allergic to casein or ovomucoid. And it sort of then guides you, I think, going forward with how to approach the patient. I've had a couple where I've similar experience with hazelnut. In other words, you make the assumption maybe that it's all BETV1, right? In other words, it's all because of their birch allergy. And that's true, I'd say 80 or 90% of the time, but not always. Yeah.
Does any of this help separate out why these people with allergic eczema have IgEs of like 20,000 and they don't anaphylax, and then people have IgEs of 400 and they anaphylax all the time? Do any of these protein sub-studies help you?
Yeah, not necessarily. In other words, I treat them much the same way. As far as, well, I think, granted, you're right, it gets to be challenging, because I think we've all seen those patients that have the 4,000 total, and their egg is 20, and a couple of those patients I've done the component to hedge my bet, and they actually act like their milk IgE is 2 or 1.5, and it's just inflated because you get this background noise. In other words, you'd be worried about it in another patient with a much lower total. But those are very challenging. So just in brief, we've already talked about this, that none of these tests is perfect, and a lot of parents don't get that, but you have to guide them through it and show them how complicated it can be with, well, this egg is 4 millimeters and this peanut is 6, why I'd be much more concerned maybe about the peanut exposure and so forth. So again, we don't have time, and I'll just point out a couple things here. that would be worth. These are great kind of pearls from Scott Stitcher. But for example, if somebody's allergic to peanut, the likelihood of reactivity with other legumes is actually surprisingly low. So when you see that pattern, perhaps in an infant or toddler, like my patient, it makes you start thinking about, maybe this isn't just where all the other legumes are reacted in sympathy to the peanut, but this might be a much more serious situation. And parents will sometimes ask about this. Well, like we checked one shellfish that was relevant. What is the likelihood of reactivity to others? So worth taking a look at. Again, in the interest of time, this is just showing you the relative sensitivity and specificity of various skin or blood tests for certain antigens. I never have quite figured out why the sensitivity and so forth for soy is so poor. I don't know, Mary or David, if you've come across any reason for that, but you can see soy is a real outlier here.
Yeah, I don't know. It's always positive in those peanut allergic patients. So sometimes I try to avoid testing to soy and other legumes, actually, peanut allergic patients.
Yes, exactly.
Because then you get false positives, and
unless it's clinically relevant.
All right.
Exactly. All right, so let me shift gears in the remaining time here. As far as future diagnostics, who knows, obviously, but these are some things that are being looked at with specific epitopes. So even if you have a patient that has exactly the same RH2, why is there disconnect here? Why is this one patient much more reactive than another? Possibly explained by GI presentation of those IgE levels, but also perhaps related to affinity for the IgE for the target. Specific Treg levels, I'm not sure that'll happen anytime soon. Perhaps DNA methylation signatures, looking at specific parts of the genome that are unmethylated. I'm not sure how specific that's going to be for anything, but it certainly does hold up for food allergic patients that, the lymphokines you'd expect are unmethylated in that part of the genome. Possibly a role for microbiome data in given patients, with the thought of altering the microbiome perhaps might be easier to induce tolerance in the future. Just a couple words about treatment in terms of avoidance, and I'll just point out a couple things that are kind of interesting. They looked at a study of parents of kids with food allergies, and 11% of them will buy may contain blah, blah, blah. 40% will buy made in a facility with, but it turns out if you actually test those foods, the risk is the same. And it just shows you how perception can kind of flavor that.
Why would anybody think those two phrases mean anything different?
No, I don't know.
I mean,
You got me. But it just shows you, as we know, a lot of this is legally driven. And in some cases, the may contain might reflect, the janitor eats PB&Js rather than the company making anything with peanut butter. And the lawyer says, nope. A couple studies looking at various restrictions in schools versus really no policy whatsoever, didn't really find a huge difference. And part of the reason is that you need N has to be probably huge to see that. There was a specific study, though, looking at peanut-free tables or not, and you can see the risk was about 2/3 less with using the tables, but still a very rare event. So it's one of those decisions, is it worth going through all of this for a relatively low event? Again, we all know this, that in a lot of situations, staff have very little training in the restaurants scenario. Ironically, in Washington, it's actually required that all food handlers pass a test every 3 years relating to food allergy. And it's probably because 3 of our state legislatures have kids with food allergy. So that's a good thing. I worked on that about obviously, you need to talk to parents about explaining the risk to staff when they go to restaurants, etc., using a fresh pan for my child, etc. The treatment, obviously, is strict avoidance for the most part, except for a high percentage of kids with egg and milk allergy, like we've talked about. We talked about the role for oral food challenges, etc. The other kicker is if you have a child who's allergic to nearly every form of protein you can imagine, it's very valuable to engage a pediatric nutrition person to help the family. And they often have very creative ways of getting the child nutritionally sound until they hopefully outgrow some of those allergies. Again, some more clinical pearls to consider for food allergic patients when they're on the road, etc. As we all know, the most critical part of this, if there's a systemic reaction, is the prompt use of Epi and calling 911. Just a couple points here, which are always sobering, especially looking at teenagers and young adults. One study in the middle here of about 750 patients, you can see only about a third of them had Epi, and only half of those had it all the time. So the sad part is that, I don't know, somebody needs to develop an Epi that goes on your iPhone case or something, maybe, is that you obviously you can't use it if you don't have it. And then there's some patients who are needle phobic and so forth. The other, this is a small study, but again, probably common sense when you have anaphylaxis. If you're administering Epi promptly, a much smaller percentage of patients needed to be hospitalized versus waiting till you get to the ER. And I think I'll skip this in the interest of time. Just very briefly, in terms of prevention, we all know about the LEAP study. More recently, the data has been expanded to being more liberal about introducing peanut in kids that have less severe eczema, and of course those that have no eczema whatsoever, which admittedly are probably at pretty low risk. And one of the questions.
Just one question. So
yeah.
When this data first came out, it was a big deal. It was on the front page of the New York Times. But it seemed like pediatricians in the community were very slow in the uptake and accepting this.
Right.
Those of you who are in pediatrics, you still find general pediatrics disappointing in accepting this data?
I think they're learning more about it. I mean, I think it's partially on us, right, to go out in the community and talk to pediatricians about this. But I think, at least based on what parents are describing, that their pediatricians are aware of the fact of the LEAP data and actually encourage.
Yeah, I think it's slow. It's sort of like egg and MMR. It took maybe 6 or 7 years.
Although that still happens once in a while, the egg is MMR.
Yeah, egg and influenza as well. Yeah, no, it still happens. But, yeah, it's slow, I think. Again, I guess we won't have time to make it through all of this, but just you can kind of take a look at this. Similar ideas with egg. Unfortunately, it's literally, apples and oranges kind of with the studies. Different age groups of exposure to egg early on, different forms of egg, and you can see that there were, out of 4 studies, 2 favored treatment, 1 favored placebo, and 1 showed no difference. So the answer is not all in with egg. The other question is, could you extrapolate the peanut data to tree nuts? And I've taken the liberty personally of doing that. In other words, if I got a child who's sensitized to egg and peanut, maybe not on day 1, but when I come back to do the LEAP, I'll actually look at tree nuts just as a pragmatic thing, because obviously it's nutritionally a nice thing to do, and 65% of the time it's fine. But if it isn't, I've had several kids that I've done LEAPs, if you will, with cashew butter and walnut butter, and they seem to be doing very well. So again, kind of using the 4 or 5 millimeter criteria for, and same sort of approach to help create tolerance. A couple other potential preventative strategies. This is some data from the Health Nut study. Doesn't really answer the question exactly, but noting that in these children, if they were vitamin D deficient, they were at much increased risk for peanut or egg allergy with the odds ratio noted there. The other pragmatic part, considering you get probably sensitized to the skin, through the skin often, is simply improving the eczema. And there's some evidence that that might be useful as well. The other question, sort of relating to the microbiome issue, would it be useful in children to add a bacteria that favors tolerance? And there's a study here showing that adding Lactobacillus rhamnosus to Neutranogen alimentum in milk allergic patients actually seems to reduce their risk for eczema, asthma, and rhinitis, sort of the atopic march, by 30 or 40%. So, kind of intriguing. Just briefly, the bottom line is that we're definitely going to see OIT and EPID in the next year or so. Surprising, basically low doses with EPID. The peanut patch will have probably 250 micrograms. The immune product will be 300 milligrams. I think the short story is the OIT approach is more effective, but there's a higher risk of side effects, much like grass tech, etc., with mouth itching and so forth in patients. We talked about using omalizumab, 3 doses before instituting OIT. That appears to reduce the reactive threshold by 80 to 100% fold. So it probably does greatly enhance the safety of OIT, but not inexpensive. Other approaches, I just mentioned, you can see them here. I thought the last one in particular was kind of intriguing. It was actually poster 630 at the recent meeting, and if you get on the website, the Quad AI website, you can look at this up. So the idea here is you attach an antigen that the patient is sensitive to the ligand for IL-22 as a fusion protein, and it turns out that delivers the antigen to the IL-22 binding site, and that induces apoptosis specifically of that clone of cells that is responding or making IgE to ARAH2. That's a very intriguing idea. So again, in the interest of time, I think these are just summary slides. But I'd be remiss if, since Gary's not here, in his honor, I put in 3 astronomy slides that you've got to look at. So I thought this was intriguing. As you know, Jupiter has these infamous storms constantly. In fact, the Great Red Spot is kind of the poster child for that. But this is a huge swirling storm. Each pixel is 4 miles in this picture. So this is on the order of several thousand miles, this swirling tornado-looking thing. These are stretch marks from volcanic activity on Mars. And then the most important one, if you ever see this on a quiz show, you say, I saw that at Journal Club. So, of course, you can see this little dot in the middle. That is called Ross 128b. It's 11 light years away, but it is exactly the same length from its sun as we are. And so the theory is that this might be one of the best chances for Earth-like activity, if you will, in the universe so far.
That's where Dennis Rodman was born.
That's right. All right. I think we're good. Any questions or comments?
Well, that's a lot of
I know.
territory. That was excellent.
That's great. Good for the spill.
I'm glad you pediatricians deal with this most of the time. There's still a lot of unknowns that are hard to explain to people. All right, so next week, actually, Gary's
Oh, is that?
Yeah.
He'll finish the Jupiter storm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So again, the word of the day was food. And the year-end event will be May 22.
Whoa! That's fuller than I thought. It's contagious, Frank. Now Mike's throwing coffee.
That's right. Is that right? Okay.
Well, Mike,
Here.
who they are, and what their presentation would be. It's got to be non-promotional. Can be work. You need to bring me the feature list, and I'd have to, that doesn't decide if
Just take off your coat, Mike, and use that.
function.
You're nasty. Nasty. Here, I'll go get some paper towels.
Oh,
Yeah, I think so.
I can grab some.
How'd you do that?
Okay.
Hey, I have a question.
Just teeth.
Yeah, this was way fuller.
Yeah.
I was just anticipating
I'm
half full. And I
That's
And off it went.
but actually just each also has the ER10 that convert and also lipid transfer. Well, Europe, together more so.
Restart. Start up again.
I got a few extra ones. There you go. Put them in your pocket, sir.
thank you.
Where you been? I was actually going
Yeah, and that's true. We don't have any guide. Now, cherries, old science, et cetera. Some of the field cherries.
Right.
And they're well educated with a bunch of stuff that's rare.
Almost any stone fruit. Almost any stone fruit. But it's near the peel.
Puts me in the spot.
I'm going to miss him.
Thank you. Yeah.
He runs the whole
Studies.
So where are you
I'm planning to go to
Oh, great. Okay, very good.
Oh, I just got a call from the mayor. You're not wanted.
Your word is that good, right?
Yeah.
Is that why you left?
You don't want to get him started on that.
Could you get any further away?
Oh, yes.
What happened to the
Yeah, just unfortunately, those 2 days are.
You didn't leave a bag?
I thought we were going to have an eating competition.
Well, young guys like you can eat a little bit.
All right, thank you.
Well then, Dr. Howdy. I was going to nail you with it in our quarter yesterday from General Pediatrics. That basically, well, that's allergies. Because it talks about like early use of early use of all right, see you later today. Early use of antacids double your chances of developing food allergies.
Patient population.
Interesting.
Problems out there.
Environmentology too. Might take early on this one too.
Specifically antacids or
Antacids are
proton pump
antibiotics.
inhibitor.
Antibiotics.
Normally,
I have the article pulled up. I was going to
Interesting.
send it to you
Yeah.
if you're interested.
Well, because they're like for rhinitis and asthma, there's a couple studies
still going
showing
to do the
that
year-end
the
event
antibiotic
over at
thing
restaurant on the
and
22nd.
Sophia Brigger left that.
Tylenol also.
A
They're
couple of
probably
people will be at the
confounded
ATS
results.
meeting, like Matt.
Yeah.
In other words, it's really
But
infections that
They're
are
leaving on
the,
Tuesday.
Yeah, but the
You know,
vast majority of
which
people,
ironically
like
are more
over
common
30,
in allergic
said
goods.
Oh.
it's the best.
Fair
But it's hard
So I
because
reserved it for them.
you need a huge number of
Same
kids to
space
study
we
in
were
a
at
cohort to
last-
prove
Well,
that.
we'll have the whole place.
Yeah.
How was that
It
restaurant?
was.
Is it Harwood?
Well, on
Monday
the
makes sense,
Monday, they're
'cause
closed to the public, only for special events.
Oh,
So
so
that's why,
that's what it always seems like.
That's by
is that like they're empty,
Yeah.
is they're intentionally.
Well, I think we'll hear
think
more
so-
and more.
I I was just curious about how they're surviving.
from a preventative standpoint.
For sure.
Until I
Maybe
realized
that's
that they
the
were closed
Yep,
to the public
yep.
on Monday, I wondered the same thing. So
Food
for
challenge
Tuesday,
about
they
5
would normally be
Well,
open, but I
you
think
gotta
they'll
get
just
there.
close it, but I can guarantee them 30 people.
Uh-huh.
They'll just
For that
it'll
space.
just be for us.
Is that the whole space? I thought there's a different part of that restaurant.
I don't know. I may go over there and look around because we're working on finding parking too. I'm trying to get valet parking for the evening, so that's not a complaint.
How come you had to move it, Dr. Altman?
Huh?
That would be.
How come it's not the faculty club?
They wanted too much money to rent the club.
Oh, okay.
At the faculty club?
As far as I can tell, these people are going to let us have the venue for free.
Yeah.
Well, although I have to call them because I had a charge from the restaurant for $250 on my own personal credit card, and I don't know what that was for. Just came on
Just a
mistake.
deposit. To
I wonder if
hold
he
it.
putting it down and he already knew my credit card. I didn't give him authorization to
Because
do
usually
it.
there would be some sort of room in your
Yeah.
facility.
So I need to check with him. I just got my credit card statement the other day, and I saw a bill for $250, and I didn't authorize it. I